Alright guys, you know what time it is. It's been quite a while since we clambered down into the shadowy pit of eldritch horror, but you know what they say about cosmic horror, right? The abyss only makes the heart grow fonder. Sorry, that was a terrible joke, but the point is I get a little broody when we're talking about writhing tentacular monstrosities, and Lovecraftian themed dad jokes are a new niche market that I'm trying to corner. Well, we've already traversed 3 parts of this particular list and you gobbled them up more convincingly than a ravenous Dagon, so let's peel back the lid and take a look at what shambling creations are lurking inside. Hello horror fans, what's going on? And once again welcome back to the Scariest channel on YouTube, top 5 scary videos. As per usual, I'll be your horror host Jack Finch, as today we curiously take a look at the top 5 scariest Lovecraftian monsters, part 4. Roll the clip.
Kiss, my dear.
For the curious amongst you, that clip was from Stuart Gordon's 1986 sci-fi cosmic horror From Beyond, based on the short story of the same name by the one, the only Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Because of course it is, this is a Lovecraftian monsters list, and as I always know, I'm a stickler for immersion. Also, it leads us to an interesting point, because as is the case with our previous 3 entries of this series, this list will not be featuring the high priest of the great old ones himself, the great dreamer, the sleeper of R'lyeh, Cthulhu, because, come on guys, we're better than that. Kicking off at number 5, Rant Agathe. And it's in the form and implication of this particular great old one where the Lovecraftian terror truly lies, because as will be the case with many entries on this list, many of the shambling horrors that lurk within the deep have a particularly apocalyptic purpose, and Rant Agathe's cosmic significance pretty much spells the end of civilization as we know it. Well, that's if it wakes up anyway, so let's tread carefully. Created by Hazel Held with an accredited co-creation from Lovecraft himself, Rant Agathe's first appearance came in the astounding short story The Horror in the Museum, which is exactly as it sounds, and yes, a Lovecraftian protagonist was stupid enough to find a great old one and stick it in a museum. And as we all know, that's terrible for business. Also known as the terror of the hominids, yes, as in Us, and he of the ivory throne, Rant Agathe is described as a 15-foot Medusa-esque insectoid amphibious god that is particularly acclimatized in the deep dark ocean. For millennia it lived in the vaporous boiling seas of Shoggoth before its machinations were devised, and it was hurtled toward Earth roughly 3 million years ago during the Pliocene epoch, where it landed in a remote part of Alaska and commenced its slumber. As The Horror in the Museum describes, it was discovered by a George Rogers in 1926, where it was briefly contained in London before being lost to a shadowy cult, briefly appearing again in the 1980s and the 1990s. The thing is with Rant Agathe, although of little power compared to the rest of its brood, this guy spells the return of the old ones. When it crashed into Earth, it was the last of the cosmic horrors to fall asleep, and the high priest himself intended Rant Agathe to be the first one to awake, to herald the return of the great old ones. Coming in next at number 4, the Shoggoths. Because although we've covered great old ones, outer gods and shambling horrors alike, I feel that we're yet to fully take a look at some of the more monstrous races that inhabit the Cthulhu mythos, and perhaps the most vile and interesting of those creations are the Shoggoths, one of Lovecraft's most curious and divisive devices, who have played an incredibly interesting yet equally horrifying role in the mythos. The Shoggoths are a race of amorphous, shape-shifting beings originally created by the Elder Things through highly advanced genetic engineering to serve them for eternity as formless tools that would do their bidding. The Shoggoths are blobs of self-shaping gelatinous flesh, almost like an amoeba, and are capable of shaping themselves into whatever organ or shape they find needful. The Elder Things abused them for eons, creating their vast underwater cities and ancient kingdoms deep in the bowels of planet Earth. The thing is though, despite being thoughtless writhing masses of tentacles and maws, eventually after millennia they mutated and developed sentience, where they rebelled against their masters and consumed them, and from there they created their own giant cities, which is where we first got a taste of the horrifying Shoggoths in Lovecraftian fiction in 1931's At the Mountains of Madness, where the last remnants of this vile race of fleshy beings were found buried deep beneath the Antarctic ice by the one and only William Dyer. And as it turns out, the last Shoggoth had sustained itself by feasting on penguins, which makes it that much more evil. Next up at number 3, Zathura. And this guy comes from a long line of great old ones that are incredibly difficult to pronounce, which even for Lovecraftian fiction is probably on the more master tier side of deciphering the eldritch tongue, but whatever. I'll give it a go. Zathura, whose grandfather is Shoggoth, whose father is Gisguth, whose mother is Jesus Christ, what is that? whose mother is Stilzemgi and whose child is known as Vilpogua. Okay, nailed it. Maybe, I think so. But anyway, the point is this particular Great Old One was created by Clark Ashton Smith, one of Lovecraft's contemporaries, who whilst having a penchant for language, also had a desire to create some of the vilest, weirdest cosmic horrors in the genre. Zathura, also known as the Sleeper of Nakai, is a Great Old One, often appearing in the form of a monstrous, vile, toad-like creature who is often found asleep in the deep bowels of his kingdom, waiting for eternity for sacrificial offerings. He's definitely the couch dweller of the brood, but the slothful of Zathura is exactly what makes him so horrifying. Deep beneath the earth, Zathura waits within his black temple, where his will is carried out by a writhing, formless spawn of polymorphic entities made of black goo that sit inside his throne in basins carved from ancient stone. Although the Great Old One himself rarely moves, the formless spawn are alive and writhing within his kingdom, ready to consume any curious adventurer or lost soul that stumbles upon him, where they'll attach themselves with their undulating appendages, rip their flesh to shreds and feed it to their master bit by bit. Perhaps more than any other Great Old One in the mythos, Zathura isn't willing to lift a finger to bring about an apocalyptic cosmic horror. He'd just rather get fat and sit on his obsidian throne and wait for it to come to him. Lazy. Swinging in at number 2, Beatis, and I absolutely adore the lore behind this particular deity, simply for the fact that it approaches human history in an incredibly interesting and equally terrifying way. When you think of Lovecraftian fiction, you don't exactly think of the Roman Empire, do you? Well, let me introduce you to the serpent-bearded Beatis, the Berkeley toad, a writhing, multicolored entity with a single eye, the claws of a crab, and an endless beard of tentacles. His appearance is caught somewhere between a spider, somewhere between a crab, and somewhere between the horror that lies at the end of all dreams. Created by Robert Bloch, Beatis first appeared in the September 1935 issue of Weird Tales, but would later go on to play an integral role in Ramsey Campbell's 1964 short story, The Room in the Castle. Although not exactly on the most powerful scale compared to the rest of the Great Old Ones, in ancient times Beatis was summoned to Earth by the Deep Ones to join the rest of his brood, but yet during some unknown event Beatis was cut off from the rest of his ilk by the warring elder gods and sealed behind a stone door in what would later become the Severn Valley. Eons later, when the Romans conquered Britain, a small band of soldiers heard the whisperings of the Great Old One and became corrupted by his will. Driven mad with cosmic torment, the Roman soldiers formed a cult around the god, which were eventually consumed by his eldritch will in a failed attempt to escape the stone seal. Centuries later, a Norman castle was built over the site that contained Beatis' prison, and it wasn't until the 18th century when Beatis was discovered by a warlock named Sir Gilbert Morley and eventually used as a puppet for his dark arts. For hundreds of years, Beatis would feast upon the townsfolk offered to him by Morley to keep his primal needs satiated, but eventually Beatis became so large that he trapped himself within his cavernous prison for eternity. Well, until he sheds a few pounds at least, and then I'm guessing he'll be really mad. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, Ubo Sadler. And our final spot is reserved for an incredibly interesting and different kind of Lovecraftian concept, because although this specific anomalous entity is very much an outer god of the Cthulhu mythos, one of the most powerful ancient beings in existence, it's also a creation that is far removed from anything else. Let me introduce you to Ubo Sadler, which is perhaps the eldritch progenitor of all life as we know it. Yeah, get ready for an existential kind of crisis. Ubo Sadler, also known as the unbegotten source or the demiurge, is a huge protoplasmic mass resting within a forgotten grotto deep beneath the frozen earth. The being itself is a life form like few others within the mythos and is comprised of a mass of writhing substances spontaneously generating primordial single-celled organisms that pour unceasingly from its shapeless form. It is thought that Ubo Sadler was the original spawn of all forms of life on Earth, spitting forth prototype after prototype before it reached its cosmic epoch, and just as the giver of life, it can also just as easily take it away, as whatever its endless mass of pseudopods touch becomes forever devoid of life. Created by Clark Ashton Smith again and first appearing in its short story of the same name, the ultimate purpose of Ubo Sadler is relatively unclear, yet deep within its ancient hive it is said to guard a set of stone tablets believed to contain a hidden knowledge of the elder gods. However, some cultists also profess that Ubo Sadler's destiny is to someday reabsorb all living things on Earth back from where whence they came, consuming it back into its endless, formless shape of Sadler. It is also said that in ancient times the demiurge split off a portion of itself and became the vile protean mass known as Hoth, the source of uncleanliness that now resides deep beneath the horrifying landscape of Mount Vormithadreth, spitting forth endless horrors of miscreation and abomination. Yeah, if you can't tell, Sadler is pretty damn terrifying, and this eldritch horror has its fingers in many pies. I mean, if it had fingers. Well, there we have it, horror fans, our part 4 list for the top 5 scariest Lovecraftian monsters. Now, I know you all have quite the appetite for the great old ones and elder gods alike, so why don't you let us know your thoughts down in the comment section below, as well as any choice picks of your own, and who knows, maybe somehow we can peer back into the abyss and find enough horrifying components for part 5. Before we depart from today's video though, let's first take a quick look at some of your more creative comments over the past few days. Patrick Darling says, my bucket list includes going to outer space, reaching the bottom of the Mariana Trench, and getting a shout out from Jack at top 5 scary videos. Well, Patrick, my good man, that is one hell of a bucket list, and look, you've already got one ticked off. Here is your resounding bucket list shout out. Now, you better get building a submarine or a rocket. I guess they're pretty similar. Maybe you can reuse some of the parts. Recycling. Well, on that oddly specific note, unfortunately that's all we've got time for in today's video. Just stick around all the way until the end. If you were a fan of this video, or just top 5 scary videos in particular, then please be a dear and hit that thumbs up button, as well as that subscribe bell, and I'll be seeing you in the next one. As per usual, I've been your horror host, Jack Finch. You've been watching top 5 scary videos, and until next time, you take it easy.